In this video, we will be talking about solving quadratic equations by factoring. All right, so a quadratic equation in X is just an equation that can be written in standard form. It's always going to be a trinomial equals 0. Notice terms in descending order, x squared being the largest term. So that is also called a second degree polynomial because the polynomial has a degree of 2. In this case, it's a trinomial with a degree of 2. So standard form is just taking that polynomial and setting it equal to 0. And in our case, we will just be focusing on polynomials that have an x squared. Please note that a, b, and c need to be real numbers and that a cannot be equal to 0 because if a is equal to 0, then the x squared goes away and you have a linear equation. So it would completely change what family it's in. So we are going to focus on the quadratics. So the first thing we're going to do with quadratics is that we're going to solve by factoring. So that's what we're going to do in this video. And in subsequent videos, I will go over the square root property. I will go over completing the square, and I will also be going over the quadratic equation. So make sure that you watch all of those videos so that you learn all the different methods on how to solve these quadratic equations. But probably the most common one is the solving by factoring. So if necessary, the first thing you will need to do is write your quadratic equation in standard form so that it's equal to 0. You will need to factor the non-zero side. Then you will need to apply the zero product property, which we will review in a moment. And then you will need to solve the subsequent equations that you create when you apply that zero product property. And step number 5, always make sure that you are checking your solutions at the end. Very important that you check your work. All right, the zero product principle. This just states that if you have two things being multiplied together and they equal 0, that means one or both of them is 0. Either the A is 0 or the B is 0 or they both are. And we are going to use that property to help us break down these quadratic equations so that we can solve them. So let's go through some examples. All right, so say we have this quadratic equation. Notice it is not in standard form. So that's the first thing I need to fix, is I need to make sure that I write this in quadratic form. So that would be 2x squared plus x minus 1 equals 0. So that's my first step, get it into standard form. Second step is to factor that left-hand side and factor it using whatever factoring technique is necessary for that particular polynomial. In this case, I would just need to use my AC method. So you should get 2x minus 1 and x plus 1 when you factor it. So that's the largest part of this right here, is to get it into factored form. So if students struggle, it's usually getting it factored correctly. All right, once you have it factored correctly, you are going to set each factor equal to 0 using that zero product principle, right? I have two things multiplied together here and they equal 0. So that means this first factor has to be equal to 0 or this second factor, x plus 1, has to be equal to 0. One of those, maybe even both of them. So if I solve the first one, I get x equals 1/2, and if I solve the second one, I get x equals -1. So two answers, -1 and +1/2. Make sure that you check them by plugging them back in to the original equation. Don't ever use anything that you have manipulated, because if you manipulated it incorrectly, you're going to put your wrong answer into your incorrect equation and it's going to say you're correct. So always make sure that you're plugging those answers back into the original to make sure that they work. Make sure that you get true statements when you plug them back in, both of those answers. All right, next example, same thing, just different numbers. Notice it is not in standard form, so that's the first thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to write it in standard form. So I'm going to get everything on the left-hand side. I will factor that using whatever techniques I need to. There's no GCF in this case. It's not a pattern, so that leaves me with the AC method. So when I do factor that, using whichever method you use to factor that, you should get 3x plus 5 times x plus 1 is equal to 0. Then you will apply your zero product property, set this one equal to 0, set this factor, and or this one could also be equal to 0. This x plus 1 could also be equal to 0. So set those both and then solve each subsequent equation. So if you solve that first one, you get x equals -5/3. If you solve the second, you get x equals -1. So again, two answers, -5/3, comma, -1. There is my set of answers. And again, make sure that you are checking those by plugging them back in and making sure that they work. It's very important that you always check your work. All right, last example for this, we have this lovely equation, which is all kinds of messed up. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up both sides. So first thing I can do on this side is get rid of my parentheses. So I'm going to distribute that 2x. And on the right side, there's nothing I can do. So just rewrite that. Okay, so if you'll notice, I have x squareds on both sides. If that happens, I highly recommend that you move the smaller one. So I'm going to get rid of that, which means I also need to get rid of that 6x because I want it to be equal to 0, right? It's got to be in standard form. I got to have it equal to 0. And that would give me on the right side 3x squared minus x. So there is my polynomial in standard form. All right, this is only a binomial. So when it comes to a binomial, there's very few things that you can do. The first thing would be to look for a GCF, and they both have an x in common. So if I factor that out, I'm left with 3x minus 1. And that's all I can do because there's nothing else I can do to 3x plus 1. So at this point, I would then use my zero product property. All right, so I know this factor could be equal to 0, or this factor could be equal to 0. So x equals 0 is already solved for you. That's rather nice. So I just have to solve this second equation, and I get x equals 1/3. So my set of answers is 0, 1/3. And again, always make sure that you're plugging them back into the original equation to double check. All right, so hopefully that is just a quick lesson on how to solve a quadratic equation by factoring. So come back next time when we will talk about the square root property to solve these quadratics.